If I went up to him and said, "Oh, Nigel, Twitter and this and Facebook, you need to be doing all this, Nigel," in 1987, what do you think he would have said to me?
Behave yourself.
It would have been a very, very quick, swift kick in the pants. And that's the difference. Nigel's a racing driver. He doesn't want to mess around with all that rubbish. And Lando should be the same. It's such a sad thing for a driver to have to take that. If he did something stupid himself, fair enough, you can take it. But it is an athletic sport. People love to go on about the technology and the rules and this and that, but it's an athletic sport. And George Russell did a really good job, and then to have it thrown back in your face was not good. I'd be surprised if Lewis is in a position to criticize his team because he wasn't on a one-stop strategy. I think that needed to come as much from the driver as it did from the team, because it was a spontaneous thing, and he can't, the team can't be criticized for that.
Gun to the head, and you had to put your weight behind one of those two McLaren drivers. What's the name? Who are you putting your weight behind if you're given a choice? Oscar or Lando? Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour. Joined as always, my friend, your friend, one of the goatiest F1 broadcasters to have ever F1'd. Put some respect on his name, Mr. Peter D. Windsor. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very well, Cameron, very well. Monday after the Belgian Grand Prix, first Monday of the August break. Feels like we're all out of school.
Oh, yeah.
Feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great analogy there, Peter. There are a very many F1 threads at which we need to pull this Monday morning. So talk to me about how you ingested the Belgian Grand Prix, sir, and what do you think was the biggest story to come out of it?
Well, obviously, when the winner loses his win because of a technical infringement, that's a huge story. So that was it, wasn't it? George drove really well, I thought, and used the conditions well, and used his head and looked after the tires. I think they used the phrase tire whisperer, which is not a bad one, actually. It's not that hasn't got this sort of Perez-like thing of looking after the rears or whatever. He's just very good at being quick, but always seeming to have a little bit more tire life than most other drivers. He's been doing that since GP3 F2. I just have no idea how he does it. And I remember talking to Jack Aitken about it when he was at ART Formula 2, and he didn't know either. Nobody at ART knew how he could drive so hard and yet still not punish the tires. I need to think more about it and study him more, I think, because he's got this amazing ability to do that. When you've got all the other drivers in the race, the Piastris, the Lewises, the Maxes, everybody else eschewing a one-stop strategy, not even thinking about it really. Possibly Piastri was the only one. Then, George, full marks to him. And my heart always bleeds for when that sort of thing happens after post-race, because it's nothing to do with the driver, just like the 10-place grid penalty for having an engine change, your fifth engine of the year, big deal. But I think it's such a sad thing for a driver to have to take that. If he did something stupid himself, fair enough, you can take it. But it is an athletic sport. People love to go on about the technology and the rules and this and that, but it's an athletic sport. And George Russell did a really good job, and then to have it thrown back in your face was not good.
He wasn't bad, was he, Peter? Before we talk about George Russell, speak to me about, I know you mentioned in your video that you think there's a solve somehow and that drivers shouldn't be penalised for the ills of the team, just like Max Verstappen shouldn't get a 10-place grid penalty just because he had an extra engine placed in his pool. What's the solve though, Peter? What do you think they should do to fix for that?
Oh, they should penalise them financially on the Constructors' Championship. Pretty simple. Constructors all got too much money anyway. So, if Ron Dennis can live with $100 million fine, shrug it off. We know that if they got a $300,000 fine for an engine change, or a $500,000 fine, or eat into their cost cap, something like that, that would be the way to do it. Not to penalize the driver on the day with, a sporting penalty that is totally unrelated to the sin. And that's my point. There's plenty of ways you can do it. Just do it on the constructor's side of the fence and not the drivers.
No, it's a very good shout there. And speaking about the sporting endeavour, that was George Russell's race yesterday. What do you think was the gift? Was it, you can argue that it was pace, but was it something to do with his ability to read the race in real time and measure the grip and prolong that final stint? Again, he did 34 laps, right? That's 75% of a 44-lap race. Not bad going if indeed tyre whisper is a characterisation, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, George has this ability to give a bit of a running commentary. I mean, he's a bit of a weatherman as well, isn't he? And likes a bit of an update and on everything. And you could see it as it was turning over in his mind as the race progressed. You could hear him say, they say, what are the tires like? And he said, oh, okay, okay, okay. And then the next thing was they're getting quicker with every lap. And then it was, maybe we can go the distance. And it was like they were just thinking on their feet, which is to me what's really, it's very, very good management and very good driving as well, to be able to think that way and to be able to think beyond the box. I think that's the other critical thing that George does, because it's so easy, obviously, because they all do it. It's so easy to be pigeonholed into one way of thinking, which is the strategy that A, Pirelli are recommending, and B, the team have talked about before the race, and other factors as well, not only strategy, but other things. And to start thinking outside that box in the middle of the race, all credit to George, all credit to his team as well for listening to him and saying, I know of several teams and engineers that would say, George, stay on plan, please, stop talking, get on with it. You're coming in two laps. But they didn't do that. And I think that's a very, very nice thing to see and very impressive. The only thing I would say, I mean, he's obviously a bit of a racer, George's race engineer, isn't he? Whoever is in charge of his car, because it's not the first time he's been floating near the minimum weight limit, as we saw from Q1 in Hungary when they ran him out of fuel in Q1. Okay, the track was a little bit wet then, but I still think a guy of George's ability would have got into the top 15 if he'd got that lap. But they ran him out of fuel. If you're running that low on margin on fuel, you've got a racer of an engineer who likes to keep the car as light as possible. Nothing wrong with that, but build in the margins, please. And it's interesting, obviously, they don't do that on the Lewis car, that they've got more margin, I guess. And it's interesting there's that much freedom between the two sides of the garage in terms of their aggression with how near they run to the weight limit.
And speaking to that, Peter, I thought it's quite interesting. I mean, if you look at George's evolution thus far in the sport, I think the criticism thus far has been that sometimes he's too keen and eager to play a strategic joker when that's not always the play. Sometimes the best play, if you're a chess player or an F1 driver, is no play, to just follow what Pirelli have advised. And sometimes in the past, George has said, oh, why don't we do this? Or let's do this. And and oftentimes that's not the way.
I wouldn't say that was a criticism. I think that's a good thing. As I say, I've always respected, in the old days, I respected the Benetton Renault lot, because they're, the whole Pat Simmons thing and Alan Permain, they're really good at just sort of making the right call in the pit lane from whatever situation's going on without being too bogged down with strategy computation. And I think Red Bull have had that mantle for a long time. But it's interesting that Mercedes, who we like to pigeonhole, possibly unfairly, as a sort of fairly bureaucratic, boring team, actually were the most creative team out there at Spa in Belgium. And that's how they won that race on the road. Okay, they then blew it, obviously, but it was a very, very good win, I thought, by Mercedes and George.
Props to the boys and girls from Brackley and Brixworth. Although, if you're to listen to Lewis Hamilton in the cool-down room, he wasn't overly enthusiastic or very generous in his praise for the team, saying that he needs to be able to trust in his team, the insinuation being that he can't trust them at the moment, and that he wished that he would have been given the counsel that there was the risk of George overcutting him, because
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, personally, I'd be surprised if Lewis is in a position to criticize his team because he wasn't on a one-stop strategy. I think that needed to come as much from the driver as it did from the team, because it was a spontaneous thing, and he can't, the team can't be criticized for that. But certainly the minute they put George, well, I mean, having said all of that, of course, it wasn't clear that he could go the distance. So it wasn't as if halfway or two-thirds of the way through the race, they suddenly decided, right, one-stop strategy. They thought, this is amazing, we'll keep going. And the tires do seem to be getting quicker. And we know they were, because he went green in sector 2 on his last lap of the race. And that, you need grip to be able to do that. Yeah. So, that they were getting better. But yes, I mean, they could have kept saying to Lewis, George is doing this, George is doing that. But quite correctly, they were also giving Lewis gaps to the guys behind him and the guys in front of him, thinking that he was going to win the race, most likely of the two drivers to win the race. And the important thing for him was to know where guys like Leclerc and Sainz and everybody else were. So, and Piastri. And he was doing a good job in that respect. And I don't think that's fair criticism, is my summation, because I think it was quite late that they suddenly realized that there was going to be potentially a race there. And that's when Lewis got on the radio and he said, what is the situation with George? And they said, well, yeah, it's going to be close. But he asked that question at just about the moment when it was clear that he wasn't going to have to come in again and it was going to be close. And if he'd asked that question 3 laps earlier, I'm not sure the reply would have been the same. It probably would have been, well, we're not sure about George. He's still on that old set of hards, but he is whatever he is, X number of seconds in front. And so it was in a way, it was kind of unfortunate timing that Lewis and the team sort of realized on the same lap that they had a problem with George. I don't think the team withheld information from him.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it all becomes clear blue in hindsight, doesn't it, Peter? Everybody's
well, it does. I think Lewis was obviously feeling absolutely gutted after that, and justifiably so, because he'd done everything that he was supposed to do according to the strategy to win the race, and he got beaten by a teammate who went outside the strategy, and he couldn't get past him in the last 3 or 4 laps, even with DRS. So of course he's going to feel gutted. And what can he blame if he wants to, or not blame, what's his rationale? It can only be that if I'd known earlier, I would have beaten him. But then again, Oscar Piastri hadn't overrun his pit stop, he would have won the race as well, possibly.
Oh. I think Lewis's qualm was that when he pitted each and every single time, he's saying that he had a lot of rubber left on his tyres, meaning as he has insinuated before, that it wouldn't have necessarily been a big ask for him to go long and do a one stop just like George did. But again, these things are always
that's right. But then again, I didn't hear Lewis at any stage of the race. Maybe the radio was withheld and we never got to hear it, but I didn't hear Lewis saying what George was saying. I mean, there's something else here, which is that when you are in front of the other guy, it's more difficult to think outside the box because you don't want to take as many risks. You don't want to jeopardize your win because you've got that narrow path with the checkered flag at the end of it. So the last thing you really want to do is start playing around with that too much. Whereas George was always in a position maybe to take a bit of a risk and think laterally, which is what he did, because there was less downside.
Yeah.
And there's that, but then that's just the way it was. And ultimately, Lewis did win the race. So I think that was just a reward for an excellent day's work and that unbelievable lap he did in qualifying in the wet.
Talk to me about that, Peter, because I saw in your qualifying review video that you were you were waxing lyrical about both Sir Lewis's lap and Max Verstappen's lap.
Yeah.
And when you get like that, Peter, it's a privilege. Explain what you mean about minimum speed and combined exit on P1. What did they do so special?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the world's greatest fan of minimum speed data for obvious reasons, because I think the Max Verstappens, the Lewis Hamiltons, the Charles Leclercs of this world, the short corner drivers who've got the touch and feel to be short corner drivers and to lengthen the straights in and out of the corner, are not interested in high minimum speed. And so it's always misleading to see a graphic, George Russell minimum speed 97 kilometers an hour, Lewis Hamilton 93 kilometers an hour. It doesn't mean anything. But on a corner like Pouhon, it's slightly different because it's a very, very fast corner. And it's not a question of extending the straight in or out. It's a question of touch and feel and letting the car sit as lightly and squarely on the road as you can. And obviously, that's again where the great drivers excel. It's an incredibly demanding, impressive corner, Paul, particularly in the wet. And so for me, it was always going to be fascinating to see how these guys did take Paul in the wet in qualifying in Q3 and how they compared, because it's just, that gave you then a litmus test of what they were doing right around the circuit, because if you're good there, you're going to be good everywhere for sure. And And it was different. It was very different. I mean, Lewis's car was very different from Max Verstappen's. Max definitely had more downforce and probably more feel for the car on the front and the back and on those new sets of intermediates. And he was incredibly good, as we saw, in terms of his margin of pace going in and how much speed he dropped just coming out of the throttle, brushing the brakes a little bit, going down to sixth gear, and then coming out, 4, 5, 6 kilometers an hour quicker than Perez and just about everybody else in the field, except maybe Piastri. Whereas Lewis had a much more edgy car. And George's way of driving it was to, to brake, to get into sixth gear and sort of lean on the car and just feel the rear. And you could see that in some of the camera shots. You saw how he was coming out absolutely loaded on that right rear. Really cool to watch, but really loading the car up. Whereas Lewis's method was to keep it in seventh and just brush the brakes very lightly against throttle and just keep everything as even and as smooth as he could. And with his touch and feel that he innately has, that was a big place for him. That was where he really got a big advantage. And that's sort of the advantage he got from driving like that wouldn't show up in the dry. He wouldn't do that in the dry, I don't think. It was just all to do with it being damp and the curbs being wet and the Mercedes being a knife edgy car anyway. And that's where we saw Lewis. And, it'd be interesting to know whether he thought about that and whether it was something that he really spent the lunch break thinking about, or whether it just happened completely naturally. And if you said to him now, wow, you stayed in seventh through Paul, he might have said, really, did I? And then he might have checked the telemetry and said, oh, yeah, so I did. I just don't know. It'd be interesting to ask him that, how spontaneous that was, or indeed how planned that was. But whatever it was genius. And as Max was as well. To be honest, I thought he was, and Charles Leclerc. Charles was really good, when it really came down to it on that last lap. He was phenomenal.
To that point, Peter, to the Max, I've watched the onboard of Max's pole lap in inverted commas. I want to say anywhere between 30 and 40 times, Peter. Mm-hmm. And on the second portion of that apex, I still don't understand how he hasn't yeeted it into the barrier. I've got my heart in my mouth every single time, but I just don't think he's going to make that turn, taking that speed in those conditions. It just seems like some sort of impossible physics endeavour. It just makes no sense to me. But again,
but what you can't see on the onboard there, obviously, you can't feel on the onboard are the dynamic loads, and that is what is determining what that car is doing and where he is in relation to the exit curve, if you like, and what. And Pouin's a great corner, but as you say, there's a second part to Pouin. And what Max was doing so well in order to keep up that speed was letting the car settle for a millisecond between the entry and that second part of it. And he just settles, the car just sits square. And then you can see he's just loading it up at exactly the right rate. And it looks unbelievably impressive on the steering, but if you could have felt what he was doing and the four tires basically square to the road, you could see that it was all, that feels good. That's perfect. There's the exit. That's how it would have felt to him. And it's all to do with that. It's the same with Lewis. It's all to do with that ability to feel the car absolutely flat on the road. The minute you're doing something, you're changing direction or adding steering or braking, if you're doing that with any sort of excess load, that's when you're going to have a problem. That's when you're going to do one of these, or the front's going to go, or it's all reflexy then. And if you can do it in a way that the car is basically equal, Fernando Alonso does this really well too, mid-corner. That's Fernando's greatest quality, his ability to be absolutely square to the road when he's doing things to the car, change of direction, for example. And it's that feeling that allows these great guys this feeling of being able to feel all four corners square for a millisecond before they do what they want to do. And to create that zone, it's that enables them, for example, on other types of corners, to lengthen the straights in and out. And I think that's a God-given thing. It really is, because there's enough drivers out there who spend enough time on sims and everything else who never, ever have that. So why? Because they just weren't born with it. They were
Wow.
born with a lot of other things, but they weren't born with that at that level.
Wow. You've stolen my follow-up question there, Peter. I was going to ask you to define what that is, what that X factor, that internal gyroscope that some of these guys are
Well, it's a
born
good
with at
word,
the bottom
internal
of the...
gyroscope. That's a
Yeah.
very, very good description of what I'm talking about. And it's, you see it, you could see it at Les Combes on the head-on shot coming into Les Combes, the right and left S-bend at the top of the hill. You could see the difference between Perez and Max. And Perez wasn't slow this weekend in Spa. He was pretty good. I'm talking about qualifying now, really, and when it was dry as well. But you can just see that Perez is, the way he goes in is just immediately loads up the car so he can just sort of feel what he's doing. And then it's all about how quickly I can get on the power. That's all it's about. Whereas with Max, you watch Max and it's just turning in a little bit earlier, and his change of direction is in a slightly different place. And it's nothing like as jerky as it is with Perez, and he's not using anything like the same amount of road. He doesn't do one of these and then one of those. He does sort of like that. And that's where you see Max's talent compared with Perez. It was a very good example there, I thought, at the top of the hill at Les Combes.
Yeah.
The change of direction. And what Max is doing, he's manufacturing a little, if there's not enough room, if you like, for change of direction, because it's a chicane. If you're going from right to left, you're going whoom, whoom. And a Perez will do that. He'll go whoom, and then he'll not throw, but he'll just move the other car there, and he'll wait for the car to load up, and then he's got his entry to the right-hander. But Max doesn't wait for that moment. Max creates a little millisecond of straight passage where the car suddenly becomes flat, and then he loads it up. And that's the difference. It's that little feel. It's just like feeling on a note of music. It's feeling the little bit of semitone that can just add a little bit more to it with the right harmony. And it's a tiny thing, but it's a huge thing in terms of multiplying it by 44 laps of Spa and a full Grand Prix distance, and how many corners they've got, 16 or something. It's a massive thing. But in one place, you'd think, oh, well, that's not much, but it does add up. And of course, it adds up with tire management and everything else. I thought it was also very impressive. I know we're going off on a tangent. It was very impressive, I thought, that Max said, oh, I'm losing the fronts. And they said, oh, yeah, well, you can play around with the diff. And of course, what he does then, he sort of effectively tightens the friction on the diff, and he's effectively taking away from everything we know on a road car, making it very sort of solid, and that's giving him the ability then to drive with the rear and create a little bit of oversteer, which will then balance out the understeer. And and you've got to do that really well, because you can easily just get into massive oversteer then. And it was interesting, like 2 laps after they gave him that message, he was like 0.3 quicker through sector 2.
Jeez. It wasn't a bad drive from Max. Although you said on your review, Peter, that you were quite surprised at how difficult it was for Max to come through the field and overtake, notwithstanding...
Well, not only him, I think for everybody, it was Lando as well. The thing that's a big surprise, you asked me at the start of the video, which was the big takeaway from, yes, of course, it was George losing that win. But I think the other big takeaway from Spa was, and it was breaking news really, how unbelievably difficult it was to follow another car around the Spa lap, more than it's certainly been in 2020, since 2022, and more perhaps than it's even was before we had the old regulations in 21. So I was shocked actually at how impaired the car behind was by the dirty air. And that's why you heard Oscar Piastri saying, free air is king. Yeah. And that was because it's a very unusual circuit on the Formula One calendar. There's a lot of high speed, medium speed corners. If it's a fast circuit with long straights, doesn't matter. But when it's a car like this, a ground effect car, and generating downforce on medium and high speed corners, it's throwing out a massive amount of turbulence now, quite obviously, given the setup they have with the car to avoid the bouncing and everything else. And this, again, is completely foreign and against everything, the principles of this whole regulation of this car. It's supposed to make it easier to follow another car. Now it's probably worse than it's ever been. I don't ever remember it being that bad at Spa. It was just ridiculous. You couldn't do anything. And then you add those ridiculous DRS trains, and what have you got? Impossible to do anything. That's what it was. It wasn't only Max. I mean, Max obviously was caught by that because he started at 11th and he had to go through the field, but it was a lot of drivers. I mean, Lando didn't have a great race, did he?
Peter, you without burying the lead, you've gone on to my next point. Lando was quite curious in his reflections after the race, using words. I think he said he was stupid in his interactions earlier on lap 1. Okay, so he made another mistake. Is there something? Does Lando have an issue as far as him down talking himself, being overly negative, Peter? And especially is that manifesting it in the earlier stages of the race? This isn't the first time this season when he's not given away a race victory, but lost a lot of places very early on lap 1. Does he need to have a word with himself now, Peter, and try and fix for this if indeed he harbours aspirations?
It's an interesting time. It's a very interesting time for Lando's life and his career, because there's a lot of things that are absolutely at the crossroads right now. The first is, starts are a bit like putting in golf. You can get the yips after a while. And even though there's a logical reason when you look back at the data as to why you've made a slower start than your teammate or the guy next to you or the guy behind you is on the same grip or whatever it is, it will eat away at you if you have 2 or 3 bad starts in a row, and you'll start to think, oh, is it me? What's going on? And then it becomes difficult. I think the first corner thing was a direct result of what happened in Hungary. And I said in Hungary that the repercussions of what happened that day and the decisions McLaren took will not end on the Sunday night of the Hungarian Grand Prix. They will continue, and they will continue to percolate for the rest of the year, in my opinion. And when it was clear that Oscar Piastri made a pretty good start, and he was alongside Lando going into what was it called? La Source, the right-hand hairpin, the first corner. And he had momentum as well. And that Lando was going to have to go around on the outside of Oscar. Hungary too, he ran wide. You surprised? Suddenly Oscar Piastri is this aggressive driver that beat him in Hungary. We had to give the win to him in Hungary. He's really quick. He'd been very, very quick that weekend. Yeah, Lando had out-qualified him. But I think it's all part of the psyche of Oscar's growing confidence and aggression and wanting to be a Grand Prix winner, win every race from here on in if he can. And Lando Norris beginning to wonder what's going on. And then we come to the second part of your question, which is that he's always a bit down on himself. I actually quite like that. And I think that's quite a good thing, because it leads to self-criticism. And self-criticism is very rare and incredibly powerful, and a very important part of any racing driver's, any athlete's growing ability. And it's one of the reasons that Lewis is so good, because he's been self-critical throughout his career, and he's never allowed others to inflate his ego to the point where he's not even looking at what he's doing anymore. Same with Max. And to some extent, the same with Charles. I think less so with Charles. I think Charles is a little bit sidetracked by other stuff, and he's self-critical in that he's not afraid to admit that he's made a mistake. But I don't think he's self-critical in the sense of, how do I do this better? Can I learn from anybody else? And that's what Max and Lewis do so well. And getting back to Lando, I think this is the biggest thing about Lando now, is that it is a bit of a shell shock for him, that he is alongside a guy now who's super, super quick. He will not go away. He's just like this torment that everywhere he looks, there's Oscar Piastri matching him and going quicker, which is exactly what I said the day McLaren decided to sign Oscar Piastri. The way I phrased it was, if you've got Lando Norris, who is good enough to win a world championship, keep Daniel Ricciardo. You don't want to unsettle him with an Oscar Piastri in the other car. And everybody said, oh, well, you want the 2 best drivers you can get, and the usual old trite rubbish. And look what's happened. Exactly what I said. You're not getting the best from Lando Norris now, because he's unsettled by Oscar Piastri. And from Oscar's point of view, it's nirvana. He's blowing away one of the best drivers in the world, and he's winning Grand Prix. And he was second at the weekend now. Second, Belgian Grand Prix.
Wow.
Where was Lando?
Oh.
And that's the problem. And all I would say is Lando has the touch and the feel almost at the level, I think, of Max and Lewis. Not far away. He's not quite there, but he's almost there, and Fernando. But he does have longer corners. They're not as long as Carlos Sainz's, but he does have longer corners than he needs to, and certainly longer corners than Oscar Piastri. And that's his problem. And he doesn't realize that. He doesn't want to think about that. Probably nobody's ever told him that. So it's not in any way in his peripheral vision, even to think about that. I think that's one thing. And then the other, I think he's become too much of a global star, let's say a social media star, too quickly. Well, he's just become too much of a social media star. Forget about the time frame. And I think that is, you've created a persona then when you do that you kind of have to live up to being. And that persona is not the persona that's going to beat Oscar Piastri and win a world championship for McLaren. That persona is one that the fans love and think he's funny, and they all scream and shout and want to do selfies with him. That's a meaningless persona that does absolutely nothing for you as a racing driver at all. And it's a distraction, and you should get away from that. In the same way that Lewis, I don't think, has ever been taken in by driving down a freeway in the United States or wherever it might be, and suddenly seeing a billboard of himself, whether it's with, whether the watch or whether it's Tommy Hilfiger or whatever. He doesn't think, oh wow, that's Lewis Hamilton. I'm so big. I'm a global star. I've got it. I've made it. Lewis would never think that way. He'd just think, oh, that's a terrible picture. I've got to make sure I've got to do it right next time or whatever. And Lando, he's a sweet guy, and I can't imagine that he's anything other than embarrassed sometimes with the amount of social media that he has and attention he has. But he doesn't need that. He needs to be a hard, tough racing driver. I don't mind him being down on himself, but I think he needs to get rid of all the social media, cut it all off, and he needs to become a really, really bloodthirsty racing driver for the second half of the year. And that's not easy. And he's, the Oscar Piastri is one of the worst guys to have in the other car because he's super, super quick. He's very, very calm. He doesn't speak unless he's spoken to. He's always got a nice little wisecrack. He's just classic, annoying Australian racing driver who's always there. He's a Jack Brabham almost. And that's going to be very difficult going in now for Lando to have to deal with. And I keep saying he has to deal with him because, if Lando wants to win a world championship, he's got to beat Oscar Piastri in a McLaren, which isn't easy. So he needs to trim down his life, trim down the way he operates as a professional Formula One driver, and become a racing driver. Nothing else, nothing more. And to me, it's like, get out of, I'm not saying, I don't know if he lives in Monaco. I imagine he does, but get out of Monaco, go and live in a house in some urban area, maybe near the factory, become a completely different person, and just become hard and as tough as nails. That's what he needs to do.
Let me push back on you very quickly, because I know you said that you're not necessarily, you don't hate the fact that Lando is so almost pragmatic about his self-criticism. Let me read out the quote, because again, listening to him, I felt like it was stark, the level of criticism that he's pointing at himself. He said post-race, turn one ruined my chances of everything. I just tried to avoid contact with people on the inside, and I just misjudged the curb, and I've gone off. So a bit stupid, honestly, almost embarrassing. Peter, I get you. I think F1 drivers can sometimes be too almost delusional, right, in how they stray away from self-criticism. But is that not too far the other way, Peter? Surely he needs to be, do you know what I mean? He can't be too negative. Otherwise, that has almost an equally detrimental...
Yeah, you're right. But the reason he's confused there, if you like, it's because he used the word other people instead of saying Oscar Piastri. And he didn't say Oscar Piastri because at the last minute, his brain probably thought, I better not mention that because McLaren might not be very happy, or it might stir up trouble again or whatever. So I'll just say other people. And then, then he just sort of went down his path of whatever he was going to say. That's what happened there. I mean, the reality is, as I say, that was all because of Hungary.
Yeah.
Who was on the outside of Oscar Piastri at turn 1 in Hungary?
True. Oscar.
And what did Oscar do?
Yeah. Squeezed him.
I'm not saying Lando was expecting him to understeer into the middle of the road and give him road like that, but I just think he thought, it's Oscar Piastri again. And the millisecond he thought that, he's off. You can't, that's why you don't want to be thinking about things like that. That's exactly my point. You don't want Oscar Piastri in your vision at all if you're Lando Norris. You only want Lando Norris. And that's the problem. And a lot of people say, oh, what does old Jackie Stewart know about it? Well, I tell you one thing that Jackie gets absolutely correct even today, and that is that most drivers have the wrong preparation before the start. They're trying to build themselves up with reflexes, with fast movement exercises, with coordination exercises. Whereas Jackie says the one key thing you want in the first corner is absolutely no emotion at all. You only want because then you're maximizing the opportunity for your body, physical reactions, just to react exactly as they should to what is going on in front of you without any thought about which driver, him, oh yeah, his wife was rude to me the other day or whatever. You don't want any of that. And the only way you're going to drain yourself of all that stuff is to be very calm before the race, almost to the point where you're asleep and you're just getting it all out of you. And you get into the car like this deflated balloon that he used to talk about. How many drivers today get in the car with them in the mode of being a deflated balloon, do you think?
Not
None.
many.
I can tell you none. Because all the trainers, earn their money by doing the skipping rope beforehand. and for Lando, it shouldn't even have been in his mind whether that was Piastri on his right or not. It was just like, I'm Lando Norris. I'm going to go from wherever he was, P4, P3 to P2 in this first corner.
Wow.
He should have been driving for himself only.
Blimey.
And that's what he needs to be. And the reason he's not there is because of Piastri. If Daniel was in the other car, he wouldn't be in his mind, and Lando would be a much better driver than he is right now, for sure.
Are you saying then, Mr. Windsor, that Hungary was a tipping point of sorts, that now Oscar's building momentum, he's becoming the driver that we know he can be, absolutely 100% he will be a champion at some point in time?
I think it was a tipping point for Oscar because he's won a race now, and he won it in a way he didn't want to win it, so it makes him even more hungry to win, and he knows he can win anyway, so it's a double whammy from his point of view. From Lando's point of view, the tipping point was the millisecond they signed Oscar Piastri.
Wow.
And it's been that ever since. Whether this is the first time he's actually realized it, I doubt it. I think, we've had plenty of occasions when Oscar's been quicker and upstaged him. So I don't think it was that. I don't think it was Hungary from a Lando point of view. But what's happened now is that because Oscar's so confident, he's getting better and better with every race. And that's making it more and more obvious to Lando that he needs to be doing something a bit different.
Do you think, Peter, that Oscar is the number one driver, notwithstanding the driver's standing? Of course, Lando's currently second and closer to Max Verstappen. But if you were team manager and you had to, gun to the head, and you had to put your weight behind one of those two McLaren drivers, what's the name? Who are you putting your weight behind if you're given a choice, Oscar or Lando?
Oh, Lando, for sure. I think Lando's got a multitude of great qualities, plus he's got his experience. And yeah, if everybody decided that we had now to support one driver, in the sense that regardless of the situation, regardless of the sacrifice, that driver always had to finish ahead of the other with points, I would go for Lando. Not because he's leading the championship at the moment, because I think he's just a great all-round racing driver. But I would be saying to Lando all the things I've just said about having to change. And, changing all the things that I've just mentioned are in his control. There's a lot of things that aren't in your control as a racing driver. So you might as well get all your ducks in a row before you get in the car, and then allow the variables to come in and do what they may. And I don't believe Lando's doing that now. I'm sure he thinks he is, in terms of fitness, in terms of his work ethic and everything else, the stuff he does with the team and the sponsors and everything else. But in my opinion, based on working with Nigel Mansell, who did win the World Championship and did blow away his teammates, all of whom were very quick, the only way to operate is to think only of Lando Norris. And to, I cannot even begin to think of what Nigel's reaction would have been had social media been around in 1987, as to how much time if I went up to him and said, oh, Nigel, Twitter and this and Facebook, you need to be doing all this, Nigel, in 1987. What do you think he would have said to me? It would have,
behave yourself.
It would have been a very, very quick, swift kick in the pants. And that's the difference. Nigel's a racing driver. He doesn't want to mess around with all that rubbish. And Lando should be the same. I'm sorry. He should be the same. He needs to toughen up if he's going to beat Oscar.
Yeah,
And he needs to be a secret. He needs to be a secret that Oscar begins to not understand, which is, Nelson Piquet never, ever understood Nigel Mansell, why he was quick, what he was all about, what the setup was that he wanted on the car. Nothing. Nigel raced only for himself. And Lando needs to be the same. He's too much of an open book. That's another thing that social media does. It makes you too much of an open book. And that's wrong. It's wrong for a driver, I think, at Lando's level.
And Peter, I'll see that, and I'll raise you this again on the back of Hungary. I think I got the sense that Lando, to say that he doesn't know who he is probably an over exaggeration. But you can't halfway be a Formula One driver, right? Sometimes you've got to make a decision. Sometimes you've got to crack some eggs if you want to be a champion and make a decision. And I feel like Lando desperately wanted to disobey the team orders in Hungary. But the nice guy in him just wouldn't let him do it. And because of that, he was seen crying in post-race in the garage, and the team was shielding him from the gaze of the world's press and media. Helmut Marko has since come out and said that of the two McLaren drivers, it's clear that Oscar Piastri is mentally the strongest one. I agree with you, Peter. I think he's got to make himself... He's got to make a decision. He's got to... there is...
I mean...
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, the problem was the mistake in Hungary was McLaren's. It wasn't Lando Norris's. And Lando ultimately did. I mean, I know he was obviously in two minds as to whether to do it. But when they said to him, if you want the team behind you as we go towards the championship, you've got to do this, Lando. What that meant was, if this situation arises again, and it's in reverse, we won't give you the win. That's what that meant, I guess. And he's probably at that point thought, well, I'm in Austin, and it could happen in Austin, US Grand Prix, championship's getting a bit tighter. Max has had 3 retirements in a row. Yeah, I better do this sort of thing. I guess it was something along those lines. But the mistake was before the race, when McLaren brought up this scenario and made the decision that if for some reason the other driver got in front with the undercut, he'd have to give the position back without factoring in the importance of Lando scoring every point he possibly can if he's going to have any chance at all of beating Max Verstappen. And I still find it absolutely extraordinary that Lando agreed to that at that point. I guess he must have thought, well, I'll always be the lead driver. I don't know. Maybe it was that. In which case he's had his rude awakening. But the mistake was McLaren's to do that. I mean, as I say, to start playing around with positions on the racetrack based on what might happen with an undercut, which has a billion other factors and variables involved, from the pit stop to the in-lap to the out-lap to everything else, as we saw from Oscar's pit stop yesterday. All those other factors come into play when you're dealing with something as big and as uncontrollable as an undercut, as distinct from a guy behind you, just let him pass, and no, he'll let me pass, which is a much more simple thing to execute. You see my point. So the mistake was McLaren's, and the mistake was from McLaren, in my opinion, was to sign Piastri in the first place. They had Norris. Wow. And then the other thing, compounding that, when Lando renewed, which I think he did last winter, right? For what, 2 more years, 3 more years?
I don't know the term, multi-year.
Well, long-term contract, he renewed. Why didn't he then say, I want number 1 status? Oof. If McLaren had said no, well, plenty of other drives that he could have got. Ferrari, Mercedes, as it turns out.
Red Bull.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he obviously did it because he feels completely at home at McLaren. He loves Zach. He loves the whole thing, the whole family there. But he forgot to say, oh, by the way, I want to be number 1 driver on the track.
Oh, my goodness.
I think he would have got away with it because I think they wanted him badly. And I think Oscar would have ceded that.
Acquiesced. Blimey, Mr. Windsor. This is all funny, techie on all things McLaren. Let me ask you very quickly as we round third base. Been super generous with your time as always. Let me pitch to you Checo Perez. Again, put your team manager cap on. Say you're Christian Horner. They're due to have a conversation at some point this week about Checo Perez's future in that Red Bull team. What's the decision that you're making on the back of his material underperformance season to date, Peter?
Well, I suppose it's with Carlos Slim Jr., isn't it? You're saying, look, if we get rid of Checo, can we please keep all your money? And if he says no, you cannot, then the deal's done. He stays in the team, doesn't he? I keep saying, it's about that. It's about the amount of money that Checo has triggered in Mexico around his own image and his own brand that he takes to Red Bull. It's not that he buys the drive. I mean, that's unfair to say that, but he earned that money, if you like, he's earned that support. And there are very few countries in the world that a driver like Checo, of the quality of Checo, who isn't one of the greatest, but he's pretty good, could generate that sort of money. It's usually a South American stroke, country like that. So you don't get Théo Pourchaire able to generate that sort of money out of France, for example, to get into Formula One. So he's got all this money, and he is capable of qualifying the car as well as he did in the wet around Spa, which is impressive. And he was actually quite good in the race in Hungary. He made a stupid mistake before that. And we've got some reasonably good Perez circuits coming up, but he's never going to be anything more than what we see. And the only solution to that is to do a lot of work with Rob Wilson. And I would say to Perez, book now 10 days of Rob Wilson in August, and we'll go forward once I talk to Rob after the 10th day, see where you're at. If not, we're going to put Liam Lawson in or somebody else.
I think
that's what I would do. Rob would have a very good feel for Perez after 10 days as to whether or not he was going to be able, under pressure, with the right structure, to be able to do the lap and to sustain that. I don't think it's ever been a problem, Perez's consistency over a race distance, regardless of how the car's handling. I think he's always been a pretty consistent race driver, very good in defense. But he's just too edgy at the moment, and he's just leaning on the car too much, as you can see from those Lecom angles.
If F1 is a results-driven business, Peter, meritocracy still a thing, which I think it is. As a percentage of the whole, it's reduced over time, right? And finances and monetization have kind of usurped that ever so slightly. However, Checo Perez would have finished, where did he qualify? Second, and he would have finished, but for George's DQ, in 8th again in a Red Bull, Peter. I just think he's getting roundly out qualified now by Logan Sargent in a Williams. He can barely get out of Q1 these days. He crashed the car in Hungary when the Tajuvidra family have turned up to see him do anything, but that's surely...
That's right. I mean, that's why he needs to go and spend... We know he can drive quite well, though. This isn't the Perez that we've always seen. So he needs to go to Rob Wilson, because quite clearly the engineers at Red Bull are incapable of showing him what he's doing wrong. And he needs to go to somebody like Rob Wilson to correct him. I mean, there's nothing unusual in that. Athletes often do this. They get into a bad habit and it kind of works. And then, so they use the bad habit again, and then it gets multiplied by 4 because they're a bit lazy and they go on holiday, and they come back and the bad habit's suddenly been multiplied by 10. That's how it works in golf, tennis, football, anything else. Yeah. But in motor racing, they tend not to be very scrupulous about the way they look at these bad habits and get drivers out of them. The engineers obviously don't have a clue, because they're just looking at telemetry all the time and doesn't mean anything. Yeah. So you've got to put him in the seat alongside a driver coach of the capacity of Rob Wilson and get him to do a proper evaluation, a 10-day evaluation, 10 consecutive days, staying in the Ibis Hotel in wherever, Milton Keynes, 30 quid a night, pouring rain. That's what he needs. Lando needs that. They all need reality checks, some of these guys. Social media stars. He's a Mexican social media star. You've got to start bringing them back down to earth if you want them to get earthy, raw performances.
Yeah, blimey. I don't hate that. I think Checo could definitely do something like that. But I feel like, sadly for him, his Red Bull career's passed him by now. He'll need to get those days in with Rob Wilson. But at best, for Checo Perez, that will be from RB Visa Cash App. At best, I mean, he could be out of a seat altogether, Peter. I'm not so sure.
I mean, Christian does have quite a lot of control over the marketing of the other team now, the Visa Cash App. So maybe he will try and juggle some of the Slim money and the other Mexican money over to that team and get Perez in there and get, I don't know. I mean, Liam Lawson is very reflexy and very edgy. So anybody that thinks Liam Lawson is just going to jump in and be, very, very smooth is going to be Max Verstappen, obviously. They're going to be surprised because he's not there. Of all the drivers, I would try to get back Pierre Gasly.
Oh,
That's what I think Gasly's driving really well at the moment, and he's super quick. And he's obviously frustrated there at Alpine. And he's the guy I would get. I think they
Wow.
made a mistake letting him go, to be honest. But anyway,
Blimey.
I
That,
think I think Verstappen Gasly would be a very good team.
oh, hot take, Peter. Blimey. Something I haven't even considered that. Jeez. And then finally, Peter, let me pick your brain on the rumoured Carlos Sainz contract. Because if word on the F1 curb is anything to be believed, Carlos Sainz has signed a 1-year deal with Williams, but with a couple very interesting clauses, being if at any point, even before he drives a single race with Williams, he gets offered a contract with either Red Bull or Mercedes, he can instantly null and void that contract with Williams. To that, Peter, you react how?
Big mistake if that's the actual wording, because why hasn't he got Ferrari in there?
Yeah, wow.
Imagine if Lewis stops after 1 year for whatever reason and Ferrari's seats available. Imagine if Carlos Sainz has just re-signed for Williams because he's just finished second in the whatever Hungarian Grand Prix and he loves the team. And then the week later, there's a seat at Ferrari available and Ferrari are on the phone saying, Carlos, come back. We love you. Come back. It's the perfect team. What happens then? Why hasn't he got Ferrari in there? Why is he only thinking Red Bull and Mercedes? Or is he so annoyed with Ferrari that he'd never want to drive for them again?
I think it's a short-term concern. And Lewis will be there at the very least a year or two, right?
Yeah, you can't assume anything. You cannot
true,
assume anything,
true,
Cameron.
true.
You cannot assume anything.
Yeah.
Charles Leclerc may not be there for the next 2 years.
Wow.
Why would you assume that? You have to assume, actually, there's more chance at Ferrari, bearing in mind Lewis's age and everything else, than there is at, say, Mercedes, where it looks like it's going to be, what, George and Antonelli, I guess.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those two are going to be into the car for the next 5 years, aren't they? So no chance at Mercedes, you'd say. There's much more chance he's going to get an opportunity again at Ferrari. And especially if he kept that door open with that contract and said, I love you guys. You know, the minute you want me back, I'm in a Williams, I'll be with you. Why wouldn't he have done that? I find that very odd. And then as for Red Bull, yeah, fair enough, you know, sure. Does that mean Red Bull A team or B team?
I think it'd be Red Bull 8. He wouldn't go B. I think he's pinning his hopes on Max wanting to go to the boys and girls at Brackley and Brixworth, right? And again, rumours of the powertrain and the fact that Max hasn't been too happy of late, their strategy, everything feels like it's crumbling at Christian Horner's team. And somehow, maybe if Toto's the businessman that we all think he might be, somehow he might be able to entice across the Mercedes one Maximilian Verstappen, potentially.
Well, I suppose if it's either Alpine, where you've got Flavio and all the politics, and they probably wouldn't have agreed to a contract like that anyway, or Williams, who have obviously agreed to a contract like that, albeit that they seem to have left the Ferrari clause out. I suppose Williams is the better of the two options, but it's pretty sad, isn't it? It's pretty sad for him. There's nothing exciting about that, and there's nothing deserving about that for a guy that's driving as well as he is and has done the job that he's done this year so far, to have to be driving for Williams next year. And I'm a Williams guy, you know, have been for many, many years, but I actually have zero feel for the team as it is run at the moment. And, you know, the way they are, I just find the whole thing so sad, actually. I don't really want to talk about it. Not Williams, but the whole science thing. The whole thing is so depressing that the whole thing's ridiculous.
Yeah. Sometimes in F1, Peter, Carlos Sainz is the one still standing without a chair and the music stopped, right? He's just the odd man out, and it's a cruel game.
Well, it's a shame that he didn't actually stay out a bit longer and maybe run that stint a bit longer, or maybe just come in, put some mediums on and then put the hard on again. Yeah, he could have had quite a good race yesterday.
Yeah. Oh dear, Peter. It's a negative note on which to finish our conversation, but sometimes pathetic fallacy, right?
Well, the only thing we haven't talked about, is why Max didn't start on hard tyres.
Oof. This is an interesting one, Peter. What do you think before I chime in?
I think they were just so focused on the medium being the right tyre, and they had two sets of mediums and only one of hard. So it would have put them in a difficult position. But I was, irrespective of that, I think it was kind of odd that they didn't put him on a tyre that would have given him some track position, given how difficult it turned out to be to overtake at Spa. But maybe they just didn't know how difficult it was going to be.
Yeah, I
which
think
is extraordinary. But imagine the teams would know. We the observers only got to find that out on race day. But imagine the teams would have known that by then. And to get track position, why wouldn't they put him on the long first stint on hards?
I think if past his prologue, and they would have been citing their data bank of recent races there, and every single time. Granted, it's more the competition is converging in real time.
I mean, I saw lots of stats about that. Incredible coincidence that it was the same thing, and Max with the penalty. Complete rubbish. I mean, what the team was experiencing this year, completely different to 2023, completely different to 2022. And for anybody, and I can't believe the teams would have been stupid enough to have looked at that past data. Absolutely ludicrous if they have, because it's a completely different championship now, completely different cars in terms of the turbulence they generate, and also very different in terms of how competitive, say, McLaren are, and potentially Mercedes and Ferrari on a good day. So if they started looking at what happened in 23 or 22, that's why they lost it.
Yeah, I suppose that's all they had, though, Peter. As far as information, you've got to look at something.
Not really. Why didn't they listen to George? Why didn't they really say to Max and Perez on Friday, we have no feel really for how bad it's going to be in Sector 2 if you're following other cars. At least we want you two guys to go out together and follow one another, just see what it's like in terms of turbulent air.
That's a good shout.
Or better still, if you can get behind a Piastri or a Leclerc and do it. Why wouldn't they do that instead of all this endless, got to do this long run, got to do the short run, everybody does the same thing. They need to be doing more practical things like that. And it was, to me, the minute I saw all those stats about, isn't it a coincidence? I thought, really? Oh, it's a completely different world than one we were in a year ago or 2 years ago. How can they even relate that to what's happening? Statistically, you can, but statistics 90% of the time are very misleading unless they're read correctly or used correctly. And they're massively overused in motorsport because it's so easy to come up with numbers about everything. Yeah. And nobody filters in reality checks or takes into account the changing nature of the sport. That's why statistics, and statistics for me are a very, very misleading thing.
It's a very
thing that matters. The only stat that matters is how many drivers have won the Indy 500 and the Formula One World Championship in the same year.
Oof.
Answer: Jim Clark. Nobody else. That's the only stat we need to take to
Let's go. I would defend, as the accountant in the room, Peter, I will defend Red Bull's strategic team only in this sense. I think they've got to discount previous results completely. I think would be a
why?
There's
no way in the world the Red Bull has the same top speed advantage that it had in 23 or 22. So what point do you have to look at previous stats that are meaningless?
The strategic team have got to, at the very least, look at them and then normalise for the fact that circumstances are different, that the competitive landscape is much more even. But
Cameron, there's no stat on how good in a straight line a McLaren was going to be around Spa until we got to Spa. There's no way the Red Bull strategic team, regardless of how good they are, could have known that. Yeah, the only way you know that is on the Friday.
100%. But they work off of. I mean, to completely discount the data, I think is, I don't know, statistically reckless. Let's say, Peter, to pin your hat to it and say that, okay, we're going to completely base our strategy off of 2023 data is absolutely nonsense as well. But to use it as a baseline and flex for it, adjust for the variables that have changed year on year, I think is.
But one guy did do that. He did say all these statistics and data is nonsense. We're just going to go on gut feel and do this how it feels.
George. Yeah.
Fair. And that's exactly my point. Yeah. To be honest with you, I think data, strategy, statistics, a lot of it is all nonsense. Well, it's not nonsense, it's misused stuff that we don't need in Formula One because it clutters up the brain into thinking about what is really important. And I wonder whether anybody at Red Bull thought about how important it is to see what this car is like when you're following another car around Pouen for 4 consecutive laps.
Oh,
What happens to the front tires? I wonder whether they thought that. And it wouldn't have been that difficult to have orchestrated that.
yeah, I'd agree with
That
you
was
on
one of the key things. And when we get into this syndrome of, well, they're not doing it, so obviously it's not important because they know best. They're a Formula One team. But, then you hear quite simple comments after the race saying, oh, yeah, maybe we should have done that.
Blimey. Yeah, I think I'd agree with you on that. Misused is probably the characterization.
Yeah,
I think that's fair.
And now there's another trite reply to everything. Oh, well, it's the August break now. Let's have a good rest and all come back. I mean, what does that mean? Do nothing for 3 weeks. I mean, most of them are saying, oh, now it's the time for hard work and, we really need to regroup and come back. And what does it mean? Rah, 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 running around the oval 4 times a day, all cheering. Boot camp. Is that going to make the car quicker? Much rubbish spoken in Formula One. It's just ridiculous. They carry on as if it's a football team or something.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's technology. And it's also man management. And it's getting the best from human beings. And it's not that complicated. It's not that difficult. Nigel Mansell is going to be a better racing driver if he's got Riccardo Patrese alongside him rather than Nelson Piquet. Duh. It's not that difficult. Lando Norris is going to be a better racing driver if Daniel Ricciardo is his teammate. Duh. And so it goes on. You've got a good combination at Ferrari. Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz. Don't split it up.
Yeah. Basics. Very, very low
basics.
level. Nothing
against Lewis. If I was Lewis, I would have taken that Ferrari drive absolutely on a plate. Perfect for his career. But if you're Ferrari, it's another thing altogether.
Oh,
they're probably thinking, wow, we got the fastest driver in Formula One. We got this guy. He's just amazing, blowing away George Russell. And he is. He's still brilliant. He's still absolutely brilliant. And I hope he wins the championship at Ferrari. Of course I do. But the whole Carlos Sainz Williams thing makes me feel sick, to be honest.
Wow. Common sense, some say, Peter, in F1 is very uncommon sometimes. Like, it's bonkers. Adrian Newey, lastly, Peter, because you've been super generous with your time. Adrian Newey talks about this a lot in his book, that he left a lot of the teams, like Leighton House March. He left that team. The decision to leave was driven by the fact that he felt that finance people were running that team, no longer were their racing minds at the helm. Do you think is that a trend that you think is dominating F1? I mean, you just talked about the McLaren decision to bring in a Piastri. That feels like another decision made with finance and brand and commercial in mind rather than a proper racing decision. Do you think is that a trend?
Not really, no. I mean, Leighton House March was definitely a financial thing, but not in the sense you mean. The guy was thrown in jail, I think, and they lost all their money. So that it was financial in that sense. So that was one. And then signing Lando. No, I think that was just Zach thinking, signing Oscar, sorry. I think that was Zach thinking, this guy's good. This guy's really good. I think Zach's got a pretty good feel for who's quick and who isn't. And I just thought, he just thought, I got Lando. He's great, but Oscar's great as well, and I want them both. I think that's all it was. I don't think that was a commercial thing at all. I think commercially, you could argue Daniel Ricciardo's probably as good, if not better than Oscar in terms of somebody the sponsors like and can work with and all that stuff. But commercial things, no, I think that Adrian's thing really that in those days was just wanting to be with a team from the ground up and grow with it organically with good finance behind it, who listened to what he had to say and spent the money on the important things like, his design team and what he wanted to do with the car. And that's what he got ultimately with Red Bull. He didn't really get that with McLaren, but he got that with Red Bull. And now he's done that. So it still raises the question of what he wants to do next, because he's done that, been there, done that. And he's gone to a corporate entity like McLaren, which is, in brackets, pretty similar to Aston Martin today. So does he need to do that all over again? Probably not. No. I would hope not. And if I would rather see Adrian personally, I hope he just chills out and drives his classic Formula One and racing cars and gets Harry a decent drive in something.
Oh, and I'm not a bombshell, Mr. Windsor. You've been an absolute legend as always. If you're not subscribed to the Peter D. Windsor YouTube channel, what are you doing with your life? for the avoidance of doubt. Go and subscribe, go and watch the God tier level analysis, post-race, post-quali and post-free practice reviews and insights each and every single time. After that, go over to your podcasting platform, Apple, Spotify, and go and subscribe and follow the Short Corners podcast. Again, same sort of thing. You know the drill already. If you're watching this on the YouTubes, do me a favour, like, subscribe and share with a friend. If you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, do me and you a favour and follow and 5 stars. Mr. Windsor, you've been an absolute legend. I've been Cameron F1. Between now and next time, as always, remember to look but never stare.